Thank you very much, Walter, and welcome everyone. I will introduce my colleague, but I will be very brief because we only have an hour for this entire event. So I'll try to be as brief as possible. I would also recommend to those of you who are on call that you keep all of your questions to the end of this session, and then we will reserve some time so you can unmute yourself and ask any questions. It is my honor and my pleasure to introduce my colleague today who is giving this talk, Professor Eva Golubiowska. She is my colleague in the Political Science Department, and she is presenting a new research that she has engaged in, and the title of her talk is Membership in a Stigmatized Religious Minority and Political Support, Non-Believers Running for Office in the United States. It's a new research project, but it continues her overall research contribution and research agenda that focuses at the intersection of political behavior and political psychology to unpack a variety of factors that influence people's political choices and political behavior. In addition to her appointment with the Political Science Department here at Wayne State University, Professor Golubiowska holds an honorary appointment as a research associate with the Center for Russian and East European Studies at the University of Michigan, and she has been holding that appointment since 2009. Professor Golubiowska has her MA degree and PhD degree, both of those degrees from Ohio State University, and she also holds BA in government from Wesleyan University. She is an expert. She is not just a national, but an international expert in research, focusing on the dynamics of political tolerance and stereotyping with respect to female, minority, gay, and lesbian political candidates. So the subjects that Professor Golubiowska are researching are cutting a variety of disciplinary boundaries, and subjects such as tolerance and diversity are, of course, irrelevant outside of the political science discipline and speak to the humanities and humanistic values as well. Professor Golubiowska's first book was published first in 2014, and then it came out as a paperback in 2016. The title of the book was The Many Faces of Tolerance, Paul's Attitudes Towards Diversity by Rutledge University Press. So today we are welcoming a presentation that draws on the United States experience and some of those topics that reflect the new data collection that she has engaged in. Without further ado, welcome, and we're looking for your talk.
Thank you both, Walter and Alisa, for a wonderful introduction. I'm really honored to be here, and I'm going to try to talk for about half an hour or so that we have enough time for questions from the audience and suggestions. As Alisa has noted, this is a new project. So I'm actually, this is the first time I'm talking about both the design and data collection and the results that I have gathered so far and written up so far. But before I get to that point, I really wanted to thank the Humanities Center board, Walter, for honoring me with this fellowship. It really is no exaggeration to say that I could not do the research that I had done for this project without the support that I had received from you. There are also other people I want to quickly acknowledge who have similarly made it possible for me to do the work that I'm going to talk about. I actually had underestimated going into this new project how much research support I would need, and fortunately, with enough research on this question around the university and beyond, I was able to find some really fine people who have contributed to the work. So first of all, CNIT has put me in touch with Arslan Gondal, who is a systems software engineer at the School of Medicine. And he was really helpful in hosting this project online. And then the research design unit that's located in the psychology department at Wayne State has been really great in helping me to analyze the data once I have collected them. So let me try to get the Zoom controls out of my face so that I can actually see what I'm talking about on the outline. All right, so let me talk a bit about this research project, and the project is quite broad in its orientation. In my talk today, I am primarily going to talk about just one big slice of it. So first, I want to quickly talk about how atheists and what I call their fellow travelers are received in US public opinion. I want to review even more briefly the experiences of non-believers running for and serving in political office in the US. Then I will describe or summarize research on non-religion in electoral politics. There's a lot of research on politics and religion, not as much on the experiences and challenges that non-believers face in electoral politics. And then I will focus the rest of the talk on my experimental study, a so-called conjoined experiment. After I identify the questions that I have tried to answer or address in using this particular method, what the design entailed, it was quite complicated, but I'll try to simplify it as much as possible. And then I'll talk about some results. I don't have time to discuss all of the results in detail, but at least I will discuss some of the major results. I'll summarize if I have time. And what I have said, I'll talk about political implications and remaining questions for this research agenda. So first, I want to note that what got me interested in this project in part is that is the role of religion in politics. This interest came out partly of my book on Poland. And what really got me interested in the US case is kind of a disjuncture between the demographic trends in our religious identifications in the US and attitudes towards different religious minorities. And specifically, what I'm referring to is that non-believers are a very fast-growing minority, religious minority in the United States. If we look at data from the General Social Surveys that go back to 1972, only about 5% of the US population reported no religious affiliation in response to a question about what their religion was. Now, by 2021, the most recent time point at which these data were collected, the number of nones has grown, or those without a religious identification has grown to almost 30%. So demographers and survey researchers report a steady growth in the share of non-believers in the US population. And at the same time, and that's kind of what's fascinating to me, is that atheists remain one of the most disliked religious groups in the country. Now, I'm mentioning atheists here, even though in my own research, I haven't specifically focused on atheists only, but I'm mentioning them here because survey questions that have tapped these attitudes towards non-believers have only asked about atheists. None of the questions ask about other religious identities that may involve issuing any kind of conventional religious identity. So let's look at some of these attitudes. Oops, I wasn't showing you the outline. There you go. Here are some, are you guys looking at the right outline? I think you are. I'm trying to have multiple things open on my screen, which I tell students not to do because it's a really bad habit. In any case, I'm showing you some data from recent surveys. Pew Research Center did a survey of US adults in which it asked questions about feeling thermometer ratings of various religious groups, including some majority groups or groups that are present in large numbers in the US population and groups that are much smaller. You're looking here at average feeling thermometer ratings on a 0 to 100 scale of these various groups. And I've highlighted where atheists, the only non-believer group asked about, were located in terms of public views. On average, 49% feeling thermometer rating, so pretty much at the bottom of the scale in terms of popularity. Now, this prejudice towards atheists or non-believers, perhaps more generally, is also present in Americans' willingness to vote for candidates, presidential candidates from certain groups. I'm showing you here data from a 2019 Gallup survey, in which survey researchers asked whether respondents would be willing to vote for a generally qualified person for president who was nominated by their party and who happened to be Black, Catholic, etc. And once again, I've highlighted the percentage of respondents who wanted to or said that they would vote for an atheist in yellow. Only socialists, according to this chart, were less popular than atheists. Now, let me very briefly talk about the legal landscape that people who don't have a conventional religion face when they compete for political office in the US. Now, historically, if you know your American history, you know that religious qualification for elective office were quite common in the States, although they didn't typically require adherence to a particular faith. At the same time, members of certain religions, like Catholics or Jews, and certainly non-believers, were legally excluded from holding elective office. Now, you know that the US Constitution states that no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office of public or public trust under the United States. But to this day, atheists are banned from holding public office in 7 state constitutions. What is more, candidates for office are expected to communicate their belief in God. So candidates who don't happen to subscribe or embrace conventional religious identities kind of have to walk a tightrope between being true to their religious identities or non-religious identities and ticking their voters off. All right. So in light of the fact that this belief in God is tightly woven into the US political culture, it is not surprising that non-believers are underrepresented in political office relative to their current or recent numbers in the US population. There is a secular caucus in Congress boasting 14 members today. It's called Freedom, Freedom Thought Caucus, but its members do not publicly identify as atheists. For example, Jared Huffman, a Democrat from California who's in US Congress, is described in the press as an atheist, but he really rejects that identification and instead calls himself a humanist. Now, given the stigma that non-believers face in our society as a whole, and also in politics, it's certainly possible that some non-believers are undercounted in political office, that we're not just talking about underrepresentation, but we might be talking about undercounting them, and any anxiety that they experience about the political consequences of their religious identities likely leave them in a bind. Disclosing their, I call it broadly religious identity to include non-religious belief, disclosing their religious identity may be hazardous to their political health, given the prejudice that is present in such significant numbers in public opinion surveys. But not disclosing it also could be politically costly because all candidates for office in the US are expected to address their beliefs in God or some higher being. So an optimal strategy that perhaps these candidates face, given that their or anyone else's identity, religious identity, is not obvious to a political perceiver, is to maybe manage its disclosure. They can manage its disclosure by delaying it, perhaps, or by reframing it. Instead of agreeing or acquiescing to media labels, labeling of them as atheists, they can perhaps describe their religious identity in different terms. So I've mentioned the example of Jared Huffman, a Democrat from California, who negotiates this discussion of his identity by calling himself a humanist rather than an atheist, even though the media have been really wanting to stick the atheist label to him. Similarly, a Democrat from Arizona who's been in the news a lot lately, not for good reasons, Kirsten Sinema, is described in the media as an atheist, but or an agnostic, but She also doesn't embrace that label. She calls herself someone who is religiously unaffiliated. Of course, some of you are probably thinking about the presidential campaign of Bernie Sanders and the questions that were swirling around during his campaign or campaigns about whether or not he was an atheist. And once again, he didn't say no, but he didn't say yes either. I think he similarly described himself as a religiously unaffiliated, or someone who is, how did he put it? Religiously unaffiliated, I think, is the label that he's used to describe his religious identity. Now, what do we know from systematic research that political scientists and political psychologists do on religion and politics? We don't know a lot about non-believers' experiences. Basically, existing research only explores public attitude towards atheists. It doesn't consider a possibility that voters' reactions to humanists or secular candidates or candidates who are religiously unaffiliated may be different. This existing research is also only based on correlational designs, which are not great for tackling causal questions. So perhaps we can capture with correlational designs like survey research, whether there is some evidence of likely discrimination against atheists running for public office. But what we can't establish conclusively is whether once voters learn other things about non-religious candidates competing for office, whether their views of atheists actually had a significant influence on their opinions. What we do know is that anti-atheist prejudice is rooted in perceptions of their so-called immorality and untrustworthiness. We also know that atheist candidates specifically suffer in political evaluation because they are stereotyped as less moral, more politically liberal, and perceived as a threat to institutionalized religion in the public sphere. There's a fear that if atheists or non-believers were elected to office, that they would constitute a threat to other religions or religions. Finally, we know that these stereotypes of atheists cannot be fully erased with information that may counter them. Now, so what are the unanswered questions that I was interested in exploring in my work? Well, there were a lot, and actually I've listed them on this slide. I have tried to examine all of these questions in my research. I don't have time to talk about the results from all aspects of this project, but I will address some of them. So first of all, given the focus on atheists, are other types of non-believers evaluated similarly to or differently from atheists? How does the level and type of office for which the candidates are running condition the influence of her or his religious identity? Are voters more receptive to atheist candidacies or non-believer candidacies for lower level elective office as opposed to a higher level? Are they more likely to elect a non-believer to a legislative position as opposed to an executive position? Does religious identity have the same influence in nominating in general election contests? In most elections for office in the US, we elect candidates, we first nominate candidates for their party's nomination, right? So voters are facing typically candidates who share their party identification. And then in November general election contests, we then have a choice between a Democrat and a Republican at a minimum. So does religious identity play the same or a different role in these contests? How does the causal influence of prejudice against non-believers compare to the electoral impact of other electorally important cues? Certainly when voters are faced with candidates who happen to reject conventional religious beliefs, they are also they are exposed to other information about them. They get other electorally important cues, most importantly, party identification, but also others. What subgroups of voters are less likely to support non-religious candidates, and what subgroups are more likely to support them? And then finally, a question that has actually has had me thinking for a long time, not just in the context of this project, is a question of how does the concealable nature of one's religious identity, the fact that a social or political perceiver can tell your religion just by looking at you, how does this concealable nature of one's religious identity further condition voters' responses to non-believers running for office? Does it matter for political appraisal when voters learn about a candidate's religious identity and how they learn about it? All right, so let me move on to the method. I'm glancing at the time here. I'm probably talking too much by way of introductory remarks. So let me quickly talk about the method. I have used what is not an entirely novel design in this research, but one that has only become popular or of growing interest in political science in the last decade or so. And it's called Conjoined experimental design. Basically, what happens in a conjoined experiment is that typically participants in an experiment are presented with information about pairs of political candidates in a tabular form. And these candidates are completely hypothetical. What varies across conjoined experiments is how many pairs of candidates, voters or likely voters evaluate and how many attributes they receive about each candidate. In my experiment, in each table which featured two candidates, my research participants who were my voters were exposed to a set of 12 randomly varied attributes of each candidate in the pair. And they had 10 pairs of candidates to evaluate, with the 10 pairs further being divided into two blocks of 5 pairs each. 5 sets or 5 pairs of the candidates were described as running for a state legislative position in the respondent state. And the remaining 5 were described as competing for US president. Now I'm going to show you next what that design specifically entailed, because it's probably a little bit, where's that link? A little bit difficult to visualize what that specifically entailed. Whoops. Trying to copy the link here, so bear with me for a second. I'm just going to fast forward to the point where you can appreciate, fast forward in the design to the point where you can see what these choice tasks that my voters, my research participants were asked to participate in. All right. Too many windows open. Share a different screen. Oops. All right, so here's an example of a table featuring profiles of 2 hypothetical candidates, candidate A and candidate B. And for each of the candidates in the set of 10 pairs that my research participants responded to, they were given information about 12 candidate attributes. They included their religion, they included the source of information about their religion, how they were learning about it, and a bunch of other pieces of information that voters are accustomed to encountering in political campaigns. Now, all participants were asked to review these characteristics or these 2 candidates and make a choice. If you had to choose between them, which of these candidates would you vote for to be president on the scale? And then they also rated both candidates on rating scales. Now, once they've completed this task, and actually they were blocked from moving on to the next pair of candidates for 30 seconds. But once 30 seconds was up, to give them enough time to familiarize themselves with the candidates in the first table, they would see the next table and so on. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing this and go back to the outline. All right, so basically, here is what the total design of this conjoined experiment was. Once again, participants made 10 choices. Selecting candidate A or candidate B, and then each of the candidates was randomly assigned to one level or one category of each of the 12 attributes. Make sense so far? Questions for clarification about the design? I know we're not asking questions for discussion, but if anyone has a question about the design itself, I'm happy to address it while we're looking at the table. No? All right. So why choose a conjoined experiment as opposed to a more traditional factorial design? There are several reasons for it. First of all, we know that conjoined designs are better than traditional experiments for testing multiple causal hypotheses in a more cost-effective manner. They allow identification of effects that are impossible to identify in traditional experiments. For example, we can compare and contrast the impact of a candidate's religious identity on voters' responses to that of candidates' education or age or gender in a way that we can't compare in traditional experiments. There is some research which suggests that conjoined experiments boast higher external validity. That is, they simulate what happens in real-life elections better than traditional experiments. And there's also some indication that they may suppress social desirability biases. All that means is that voters have a harder time figuring out, by looking at all these tables with many attributes and multiple candidates, what the research question you're trying to address is. So they're likely to behave more naturally rather than manage their impressions. All right, my participants were recruited on Amazon Mechanical MTurk platform. Majority were white and male. They ranged in age from 18 to 85, with an average participant being 40 years old. An average participant had a bachelor's degree. Half the sample identified as Democrats, and half the participants were Catholic, and almost 20% reported no religious affiliation or identified as an atheist, a non-believer, or secular. All right, how does one analyze data from this kind of a design? Well, a key statistic of interest in the analysis of these data is called the average marginal component effect, or an AMCE. In the sort of experiment that I have designed and implemented, the AMCE refers to the average change in the probability that a particular candidate profile will be chosen when it includes the listed attribute value instead of the baseline attribute. The dependent variable, so basically, what's the average change in probability that a voter would favor a Christian over a non-believer candidate, or a candidate who happens to be an atheist as opposed to one who is secular. The phenomenon that I'm trying to analyze, the dependent variable, is vote choice, and it's coded 1 when a particular profile is selected and 0 when it's not. Now, each predictor, that is each of the variables I manipulated in the design, is coded on a 0 to 1 scale. So the magnitude of the effects of any level of any attribute is directly comparable to others and easy to interpret. So far, I've talked about the design. Let me move on to the discussion of the results. Some results from this experiment. First, I'm showing you the results based on the full model. So these are the aggregate results, which show the impact of religious identity on vote choice. I'm leaving out the other attributes in the table for now. That is the other attributes in the design. And what you're looking at is a table that is that shows you what happens when voters, what the effect of a candidate having a particular religious identity is when the candidates, when their religious identity is compared to a particular baseline or an excluded level. So what this basically shows is that when voters are choosing a Christian as opposed to an atheist candidate, a Christian candidate has a 4% advantage in their evaluation. When voters choose a religious as opposed to an atheist candidate, on average, across all the many profiles in my design, they favor a religious candidate by 3%. There is no difference in their responses to non-believer and secular candidates compared to an atheist. Now, when the baseline or the comparison category is Christian, voters are less likely by 5% to pick a non-believer candidate, and by a smaller margin of 3%, a secular candidate. That is, they favor a Christian candidate by 5% over a non-believer and 3% over a secular candidate. When looking at the non-believer baseline, voters prefer a religious candidate by 4% and prefer a secular candidate over a non-believer by 2%. Finally, and that's it, actually, that's all the significant results. The rest of the table is empty because since I'm making pairwise comparisons here, the results are basically equivalent. They are just mirror images of what you see in that diagonal half. I'm not sure how to describe that, the upper triangle of the table. All right, how am I doing on time? Let me just look at my phone. I probably have a few more minutes, which is good.
Well,
so,
you have half an hour more.
Oh, but I thought we were going to reserve some time for questions, right, and discussion.
Oh, yeah, that's true. But
Yeah,
you have 20 minutes more.
Okay, terrific. Now I've showed you so far the overall impact of different religious identities, which the candidates might embrace. What I haven't showed you is how the impact of different religious identities may compare to other attributes that may influence our political evaluation and that I manipulated in the design. Now, so here is a summary of those. Those are just the significant effects. So in addition to religious identity, voters prefer candidates who have less than college education. They prefer high school graduates by 3%, and those with some college by 3% over college grads. Not surprisingly, probably older candidates are penalized compared to the youngest candidates who are the excluded category. Now, this was a rather surprising finding to me, given the anti-incumbent sentiment that's been dominating political discussions. And that's that candidates with no experience at all, no previous experience in political office, were penalized by a whopping 12% compared to candidates with 12 years of political experience, the excluded category. Family status of the candidates mattered a little bit, with single candidates being penalized compared to married candidates with children. And then party affiliation mattered overall, but this is just a reflection of my sample that was dominated by Democrats. So overall in this sample, it's no surprise that Republican candidates were penalized compared to Democratic candidates by an average of 6%. Now, in addition to looking at the overall scenario, looking at the impact of religious identity in the sample as a whole, I also was curious to determine whether the impact of this of differences in religious identity will be different in different types of elections. Certainly when one thinks about the stakes involved in elections to local as opposed to national and legislative as opposed to executive office, the stakes are perceived as being considerably different. So my hypothesis was that voters would be much more likely to penalize non-religious candidates who were running for higher level national office than lower level legislative office. And my results are consistent with that to some extent. As expected, Christian candidates have a considerably smaller advantage over atheist candidates when competing for a state legislative position than when competing for US president. But Christian candidates have the same advantage over non-believer candidates in both electoral contexts. 5% advantage Christians over secular candidates have a 4% advantage when running for president, but they're evaluated similarly in legislative elections. Religious candidates are also favored over atheists by the same margin of 3% in both types of elections. Religious candidates are favored over non-believers by 6% in state legislative elections and 3% over non-believers in presidential elections. Finally, secular candidates are favored over non-believers by 4% in state legislative elections only. Now, finally, by way of discussing some of my results, I wanted to examine the question of whether the impact of religious identity depended on the type of an election in which voters were making their judgments. Specifically, given that the candidate's party identification in my experiment was fully randomized, participants saw candidates, some candidates who may or may not have matched their own party identification. So with this in mind, I have conducted some analysis to examine the effects of candidate religion and also a source of information about her or his religion in primary election-like scenarios. So these are scenarios in which voters face two candidates in a table who share their party ID. In general election-like scenarios, this is when voters are facing one candidate who is a Democrat, another who is a Republican. And then in some less likely scenarios, but not completely unlikely, in which voters face two candidates representing the political party, somehow that got cut off, the political party with which they don't identify. So a scenario like now our Vice President Kamala Harris faced in her election to the US Senate in 2016, when she was one of the two Democrats running for the seat from California in that state. All right, so what do the data suggest? Basically, Democratic voters largely do not use religious identity as a voting cue in either of the election scenarios, or actually even in these less likely scenarios when they make a choice between two Republican candidates. Independents have a preference for Christian and religious candidates over atheists by a margin of about 7% in both primaries and general election-like scenarios. I'll let you just quickly glance at the rest of the results in an effort to wrap this up. Now, where the bias is most significant, not surprisingly, given what we know about the sources of religious or anti-religious prejudice, is among my Republican voters. Republicans are most likely to use religious identity as a voting heuristic in all three election scenarios. And specifically in primary election scenarios where they choose between two Republican candidates. They favor Christian and religious candidates by over atheists by 18%, over non-believers by 17%, and over secular candidates by 14% and 13%, respectively. In general election-like scenarios, Republicans still favor Christian and religious candidates, although, as I'd expected, by somewhat smaller margins. Atheists by 13 and 10, non-believers by 13% and 9, and then secular candidates by a smaller margin, or smaller margins of 9 and 6%, respectively. When faced with a less likely election permutation that involves two Democrats, Republicans favor Christian and religious candidates still by significant margins that I've listed on this slide. All right, so I'm going to try to wrap it up by discussing what I've said so far and alluding to the results I haven't included in this presentation. So to recap, the results from the Conjoined experiment that I have designed and implemented are substantially in line with the hypotheses about the links between religious identity and political evaluation. In contrast, and this is a finding I skipped over because that finding was what we could call an nothing burger, I guess, colloquially. In contrast, my findings demonstrate that how voters learn about a candidate's religious identity, whether they learn directly from the candidate or they learn from the news media report or from a political opponent, doesn't influence their judgments of the candidates. Now, in the aggregate, the results that I have shared with you today show a substantial political advantage that Christian and religious candidates enjoy over candidates who happen to be atheists, non-believers, or secular. Although interestingly, they also demonstrate that candidates described as secular, as opposed to atheist or non-believer, are preferred over candidates described as non-believers. Now, the aggregate results identify as a sizable political edge that candidates with conventional religious identities enjoy in electoral politics, but they mask important contextual and also individual differences in how religious identity influences political choices. So Christian candidates have a larger advantage over atheist candidates when competing for US president than when competing for a state legislative office, for example. Christian candidates are also favored over secular candidates when running for president, but don't have an advantage when running in state legislative elections. Now, I've indicated here that I have found a lot of significant individual differences in this research. I haven't really had time to discuss them, but as you would actually, one individual difference I suppose I have discussed directly is a difference as a function of the voters' party identification, with Democrats, Republicans, and then independents assigning a different weight or no weight to a religious identity. All right. Now, the results I have briefly summarized are also in keeping with my expectation. Sorry, let me just, I'm rethinking the wisdom of going down this route. I was going to elaborate on the individual differences, but instead, just to make sure we have some time for questions, let me talk a bit about the political implications, or do I even want to do that? How much time do we have? 11 minutes. How many burning questions do we have in the audience or comments for discussion?
Yes, so we don't have any questions in the chat, but maybe we can weave political implications with the questions, depending on what the questions are.
So, sorry, did you say that I might want to skip over this and then see if there are questions?
Sure.
Yeah, that sounds like a good plan.
We only have 10 minutes left, but
yeah. Yeah, so thank you for your attention. Sorry for kind of rushing through parts of this. This has been a project that certainly has kept me busy for months now, and it's of course not done because it's generated some new questions and follow-up studies and replications. But anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we get the virtual applause from participants on the chat. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. So we only have 10 minutes left, but feel free to raise your hand and ask a question. And now I recognize several people in the audience who are the researchers of the religion themselves. So I'm curious to see if they have any questions. Robert, I think, is asking a question in the chat, right? Or is making a comment. Robert, would you like to unmute yourself and just make a comment verbally? You're muted right now. Just click on the unmute button. It's in the lower bottom left corner. Can you unmute yourself? Okay, he's unable to unmute himself.
Jackie can unmute him, or you can unmute him.
Oh, he's unmuted
okay,
now.
I'm okay now.
Yes, okay.
Okay, I'm an atheist who goes to church every Sunday as a Unitarian. We have 2 Unitarian members in Congress, and I've often wondered if that's the same strategy some of them use. I'd also like to point out we have Jews in Congress, and being Jewish ethnically means you can still be an atheist. And finally, we have Buddhists in Congress, and I have read that at least half of the Buddhist sects do not believe in God. And I wondered how that might affect your thinking about this matter.
Well, I think thanks for your comment, and I'm certain my research is not really meant to address how the many ways in which people can define their religious identities. I'm rather interested in studying their political impact. So when people run for political office, they're oftentimes labeled with partisan or ideological or religious labels, whether by the media or by their political opponents. And my interest is in the question of how that influences voters' responses to these candidates. So, I mean, you're certainly alluding to a lot of variation in what I call the non-believer universe. And my research on the political implications of this variation is so far rather limited, in the sense that I have only conveyed 3 types of non-religious identities in my research to see what their impact is. My candidates were either described as non-believers or secular or atheists, but there are of course others, whether humanists or religiously unaffiliated or religiously other, or different people can identify differently in terms of the religious identities. Now, Buddhists, I'm not really a scholar of religion. I'm a scholar of prejudice and intolerance and politics. So I can't really speak to the Buddhist beliefs, but perhaps in future research, I will include them. If I continue with this line of inquiry, which I'm very much interested in, I might include them in my kind of more systematic examination.
I guess all I'm saying is that there are probably some hidden atheists out there under some.
Oh yes, that's certainly a point that I just alluded to in my opening remarks, but in a manuscript that's based on this project, I note that it's hard to really know how underrepresented non-believers are, because we can't really count them accurately. Some are just not out about it, given that there's a social stigma or a political stigma that comes with being someone who doesn't perhaps believe in God or has different ideas about the universe, right? Now, Michael is asking in chat whether political candidates, especially for president, are required to state their religious affiliation. It's not, it's a norm. It's a strong norm that all candidates for office speak to their religious beliefs in one way or another. If they don't, someone else will. So I think kind of stereotypically, and that was at least the stereotype to which I subscribed, that norm was really strong was really strong for candidates on the political right. But research on religion and politics that has systematically examined the ways in which candidates bring in or don't bring in their religion into their political candidates shows that candidates both on the left and on the right are expected to reveal their religious beliefs, and they also internalize that belief. They might not come out as being of a particular religious affiliation, but they will certainly at least make references to their belief in God. That's the norm with regard to that is even stronger than the norm that requires you to, oh, Ron, you can correct me or elaborate or expand on it. Thank you for raising your hand. Yes, we have, although you're muted, so. Ron, you're muted.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Eva, excellent talk. I have two questions. One, if a candidate who's running for office makes the suggestion that my beliefs are much like Madison and much like Washington's beliefs, would that matter? So, in terms of if in your script, you have the respondent is told that candidate A believes much like Washington in terms of not Christian, but deist. I mean, that kind, or that Lincoln did not, or much like Lincoln. Do you think that might change the way, would it change the way people in the survey responded? And could a candidate actually use that? Particularly,
yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I thought you were finished.
Particularly a given a Republican candidate. So would someone say, I believe just like Washington believed, or I believe just like Madison believed? Would that help? Would that change the way people?
I mean, this specific reference would probably be pretty obscure to most voters, I would imagine, okay. Right? Okay. Maybe I'm giving voters or likely voters too little credit, but I mean, you're raising an important question about how the candidates can manage this religious identity if it doesn't happen to align with what I call conventional religious identities. Candidates do have to, given the stigma that's associated with this atheist label that really dominates media reports and certainly political candidates. I think Hillary Clinton's campaign in 2016 at least considered using some campaign advertising to label Sanders an atheist. So given that there is this, I think, societal fear or anxiety about atheists, for political reasons, candidates both have to issue this identity, even if they deep down, identify as atheists. Yep. And then since they have to address the question of the religious identity, that's a very strong norm, they have to figure out how to describe it. Okay. So, I've said that survey research to date has asked about opinions or feeling thermometer evaluations of atheists or willingness to vote for an atheist for president. But interestingly, speaking of framing your non-religious identity, the general social surveys, one of the major academic surveys used by social scientists who study public opinion and political behavior and other things, doesn't actually ask about atheists, but instead, I guess, implicitly defines atheists as people who are against all churches and religion. I mean, I've just been bothered by that wording of tolerance questions about what tolerance researchers have considered measures of tolerance of atheists. But the questions don't ask about atheists even. They simply say, how would you feel if a person who is against all churches and religion were to teach in public schools? Would you allow or not allow that person to teach in public schools? So in this case, the framing is certainly over the top negative, making it on some level, stacking the deck against finding high levels of tolerance, right? Because of this particular framing of atheists. But do atheists even have to be against all churches and religion? Of course not. They just perhaps happen to find religion, conventional religion, irrelevant to their lives, right? So anyway, but thanks, Ron. Good point about kind of framing how the candidates, and that perhaps will be the next phase of my research, or one of the next phases of my research, to figure out, what are some different ways of making one's non-religious identity more palatable to potential supporters. And this appears to be especially necessary on the political right, where fewer candidates to date have run without a conventional religious identity, but we also don't know how many of them are in the closet, so to speak, right? Because they know what the political fallout would be.
Right.
Now, what we do know from general social surveys, for example, is that among, the public in general, even among Republicans, there is today a pretty significant minority of Republicans, survey respondents who don't identify with any religion. They pick none when they are asked about their religious identification. Sorry, you were going to speak up.
Thank you very much, everyone. We are actually at a time, but perhaps if there is one burning question, we can allow one last question, if you don't mind. Anybody else would like to ask the last question? And no pressure, you don't have to be a Christian to ask the last question.
Well, one last question then. Eva, do you think will age replacement, is it possibility that age replacement will impact what you're finding? So as older voters die, and as we have a declining religious attendance, will that change what we're finding in terms of the ability of candidates to actually run, in terms of particularly if you have this age replacement over maybe 10 years, 15 years, and so that if we looked at kind of the younger cohort, would that maybe change in terms of the ability of a Republican to run as an atheist, or say I'm atheist? But would that make any difference? Just given the kind of what we know about attendance and stuff like that.
I mean, that's an excellent question, and I certainly would expect it, right? As we expect that other types of tolerance are likely to grow over time, or have already grown significantly with generational replacement. Perhaps tolerance of non-believers, including atheists, will grow over time as well. Now, one way that I can get purchase on this prediction with my data is by looking separately at how voters in my conjoined experiment, who differed in their age, responded to this religious cue that I manipulated. And interestingly, age doesn't really matter that much. But I need to, the caveat is that I don't really have a super good or super extensive distribution of age in my sample. mTurk samples of the sort that I've used in my research tend to be younger than the population as a whole. So perhaps even with my efforts to differentiate between the younger and the older mTurk workers who were my voters, I still don't have a lot of variation in terms of age. Like I don't have a lot of much older people who might certainly be expected to be more prejudiced, right?
Yes.
But anyway, so that's all I know so far. But based on what we've been seeing with other types of tolerance growing with generational replacement, I certainly would expect that to be the case here.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Eva, for sharing your research with us today and everyone for joining. It almost sounds like there are more questions that could be addressed and maybe room for creating a new interest group on Wayne State University campus. But looking forward to seeing your research in print and staying in touch, and feel free to, because the meeting is really short, but if you have any other follow-up questions, we encourage you to reach out directly to Professor Galibiowska with those questions as well.
Thank you so much, Elisa, for moderating this. I'm really honored to have you on board here, and thanks for all your support with this project as well.
Thanks, everyone.
And thanks everyone for attending. I appreciate it. Have a good afternoon.